Welcome to Midnight Archives, a place where you'll hear the quiet whisper of the past. Where great events don't shout about themselves but unfold slowly, like a scroll carefully unrolled in the silence of a library. Here, we won't frighten you with mysteries that don't exist, and we won't promise answers where humanity's greatest minds are still searching. Instead, we offer you a walk through the ages, step by step, fact by fact, name by name, breathing alongside those who lived long before us yet left behind something so magnificent that we still cannot look away. Today we begin our first great journey, a series of stories about the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This list was born more than 2,000 years ago, when the Greek poet Antipater of Sidon, standing on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, wondered, which creations of human hands deserve to be remembered forever. He chose 7. Not because other wonders didn't exist, there were countless others. But 7 was a number the ancients considered perfect. 7 planets visible to the naked eye. 7 steps to heaven. 7 days of creation. And so, among all earthly achievements, 7 structures were recognized as the pinnacle of mastery, courage, and faith. Of these 7 wonders, only one has survived to our day. The rest have vanished, some dissolved in the ashes of fires, others collapsed under the blows of earthquakes, and still others perhaps never existed in the form ancient travelers described. But even those that disappeared left a trace, in books, in legends, and in the imagination of generations. And it is precisely this trace we will attempt to recover today, without rushing, without oversimplifying, without turning history into a fairy tale, yet without hiding it behind a wall of dry dates and figures. The first wonder we'll begin with is the most ancient and the most enduring. It has stood for nearly 5 millennia, surviving empires, wars, ages of oblivion and renaissance. These are the Great Pyramids of Giza, erected on the banks of the Nile in times when Europe had not yet discovered writing, and in the Americas, the first settlements were only beginning to appear. These pyramids are not merely tombs. They are a map of the heavens, a time machine, a symbol of power and faith, an engineering challenge hurled at eternity itself. And so we stand before the first wonder, before that which has outlived centuries, empires, oblivion, and has once again become a symbol of human intellect. But consider this, how is it even possible? In a world without steel, without wheeled carts, without engines, without even the simplest iron tools, how did people 5,000 years ago manage to erect a structure that remains the heaviest man-made object on Earth? Picture this, you're standing on the banks of the Nile. Around you, reeds, clay, wooden boats. People dressed in linen loincloths. Their tools, made of copper, which is softer than a modern person's fingernails. And yet, they lift blocks weighing 15, 20, even 50 tons. They level a foundation covering 13.5 acres with centimeter precision. They align the sides to the cardinal directions with less deviation than many modern buildings. How? This question has tormented scientists for 200 years. We know who built the pyramids, Pharaoh Khufu and his people. We know why, to ensure the immortality of the ruler's soul. But exactly how, there is still no single answer. Were there giant ramps spiraling around the pyramid like a coil of time? Or perhaps the blocks weren't dragged upward at all but poured right on site, like concrete into formwork, leaving imprints of ancient fabric on the stone. Maybe they used water, not just for lubrication but to create floating platforms inside temporary canals dug around the construction site. Or perhaps there existed a technology we simply cannot imagine, because it vanished along with those who knew it. Today, Archaeologists are finding new papyri, scanning the pyramids with neutrons and cosmic rays, discovering hidden voids no one knew existed. In 2017, an international team of scientists discovered a secret chamber above the Grand Gallery, more than 30 meters long. What's inside? We don't know. And we may not know for decades. This is why the pyramids are not just stone. They are a challenge. A challenge to our imagination, our logic, our understanding of what humans are capable of. Construction of the pyramids began under Pharaoh Khufu, whom the Greeks called Cheops. He ascended to the throne around 2589 BCE, during the height of Egypt's Old Kingdom. This was a time when Egypt was a unified state, governed from Memphis, and when the pharaoh's power was absolute. He was considered a living god, son of the sun god Ra. But being a god on earth meant not only receiving worship but also maintaining order, ma'at, against chaos. And one of the pharaoh's primary tasks was preparing for life after death, for only one whose body was preserved could continue to rule in the afterlife. Khufu decided to build himself a tomb that would surpass everything created before him. His father, Sneferu, had already built 3 pyramids, one at Midam, 2 at Dashur, including the famous, bent pyramid, whose walls suddenly change angle at a height of 50 meters. Why? Because the engineers realized, if they continued building at that angle, the pyramid would collapse under its own weight. It was a costly but valuable lesson. And Khufu, inheriting his father's experience, commissioned his architects to create a structure that would stand forever. The chief architect, according to ancient Egyptian sources, was Humayunu, Khufu's own nephew, high priest and chancellor of the realm. His statue, found in one of the chambers near the pyramid, shows a man with a full face, possibly even suffering from obesity, a sign of high status. On his knees rests a scroll, a symbol of knowledge. It was he, most likely, who oversaw all the calculations, logistics, recruitment of workers, and procurement of materials. Construction began, as scholars now believe, immediately after Khufu's ascension to the throne, and lasted approximately 20 years. These were not years of chaotic labor. This was a precisely planned project, comparable in scale to launching a space program in our time. Each year, during the Nile's flood, from July to October, when fields were submerged and agricultural work ceased, thousands of men were called up for state labor. This was not slave duty but a form of taxation, labor instead of grain. Archaeological discoveries made in recent decades have completely refuted Herodotus's old version that the pyramids were built by slaves under the whips of overseers. In 1990, Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass discovered an entire workers' village near the pyramids. There were houses, kitchens, bakeries, breweries, hospitals. Bone analysis showed that workers received proper nutrition: beef, mutton, fish from the Nile, onions, garlic, bread, and beer. Beer in ancient Egypt was thick, nutritious, almost like soup, and contained little alcohol. Even children drank it. When bone fractures occurred, and such cases existed, medical care was provided. Many skeletons show signs of healing, indicating a high level of care. Workers were divided into crews of 20, and each crew had its own name. One was called Friends of Khufu, another, Drunkards of Khufu, a third, Greens of Khufu. These names are found on clay vessels and on the blocks themselves, where workers left graffiti, not acts of vandalism but rather signatures, as if saying, "We were here. We built this." How many people participated in the construction? The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt 2,000 years after Khufu, wrote that 100,000 men worked simultaneously, rotating every 3 months. Modern researchers, including American archaeologist Mark Lehner, consider this figure exaggerated. By their estimates, between 15 and 20,000 people were on site at any given time, enough to ensure continuity of work but not so many as to be impossible to feed. Mortality certainly occurred, especially when working with heavy granite blocks transported from Aswan, 500 miles to the south. But these were not mass casualties, merely the inevitable losses of any major construction project in the ancient world. Now, about the structure itself. The Pyramid of Khufu originally reached a height of 481 feet. Its base is a nearly perfect square with sides of 755 feet. The deviation from a right angle is less than 1 arc-minute. How did they achieve this? Probably through simple yet ingenious methods. For example, to align the sides to the cardinal directions, the Egyptians observed the rising and setting of certain stars and stretched ropes between stakes. To level the platform, they used a system of channels filled with water. Where water didn't cover the stone, they chiseled it down until the surface became perfectly flat. Each side of the pyramid is oriented almost exactly to the cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. The deviation is less than 3 arc-minutes, a precision many medieval builders could not have achieved. This was no accident. The Egyptians believed that the pharaoh's soul, after death, would ascend to the sky and join the fixed pole star in the north or the constellation Orion in the south, which they identified with the god Osiris. And indeed, if you draw lines through the 3 small satellite pyramids located next to Khufu's pyramid, they mirror the arrangement of the 3 stars in Orion's belt. This is no coincidence. This is a map of the heavens, carved in stone. The pyramid consists of 2,300,000 limestone blocks. Most weigh between 2.5 and 3 tons. But the interior chambers, the king's and queen's chambers, as well as the grand gallery, are lined with granite transported from the quarries of Aswan. These blocks weigh up to 15, and some even up to 50 tons. How were they lifted? There is still no consensus. The most plausible theory involves the use of long earthen ramps. Perhaps they first built a straight ramp on the southern side, then a spiral one winding around the pyramid as it grew. In 2015, French archaeologist Jean-Pierre Houdin discovered remnants of a spiral ramp at Dashur, supporting this hypothesis. But there's another mystery: how did they move the blocks across the ground? In 2014, Dutch physicists conducted an experiment showing that if you wet the sand in front of the sledges carrying the load, friction is reduced by half. And indeed, on one ancient Egyptian fresco found in the tomb of Jehuti-Hotep, 172 men are depicted pulling a statue on a sledge, while one person in front pours water on the sand. This is not a metaphor. This is an instruction manual. Now imagine the scale: every day, 300 blocks needed to be installed to finish within 20 years. That means 1 block every 2 minutes, around the clock. This required incredible coordination, from quarrying the stone to its installation. And all of this, without wheels, without iron tools, without horses. Only copper, wood, ropes, water, and the human mind. Inside the pyramid, there is not a single inscription dedicated to Khufu. Only in 1837 did British explorer Howard Vyse, crawling through narrow chambers above the king's chamber, discover hieroglyphs painted in red. Among them, Khufu's name. This became decisive proof that the pyramid belonged to him. Before this, many, including Napoleon, had doubted it. What did the ancient Greeks say about the pyramids? Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century BCE, recorded the stories of Egyptian priests who claimed that construction took 20 years and cost Egypt a sea of tears. He wrote that Khufu was a tyrant who closed the temples and forced the entire nation to work for him. But modern findings show otherwise. Temples continued to function during this period, and workers received decent provisions. Perhaps the priests Herodotus spoke with were simply passing on oral tradition distorted by time. Or, more likely, they wanted to warn Greek rulers against such vanity. Today, the Pyramid of Khufu is the only one of the 7 wonders to survive to our day. It has outlasted the Persian conquest, Hellenism, Roman rule, Arab caliphates, the Crusades, colonialism, and world wars. It stands. And perhaps it will stand for thousands of years more. And although the Pyramid of Khufu remains the pinnacle of ancient engineering, it did not emerge from nothing. It was preceded by decades of trials, errors, and bold experiments. The very first step on this path was the step pyramid of Djoser, erected at Saqqara nearly a century before Khufu. Its creator, the wise vizier Imhotep, was the first in human history to wonder, what if we built a tomb not underground but toward the sky? He stacked 6 mastabas, traditional rectangular tombs, one atop another, creating a structure 60 meters high, resembling a giant staircase for the pharaoh's soul leading to the stars. Imhotep was so great that thousands of years later he was deified as a god of medicine and wisdom, the only commoner in ancient Egyptian history to receive such an honor. But the true breakthrough came under Sneferu, Khufu's father. He was obsessed with the idea of the perfect pyramid. First, he completed the pyramid at Midam, begun by his predecessor, but it proved unstable. Then he began building a new one at Dahshur, the so-called bent pyramid. Engineers set a steep angle of 54 degrees, but at a height of 50 meters, the walls began cracking under the incredible pressure. They had to urgently change the angle to a gentler 43 degrees. The result was a strange but sturdy structure resembling a broken back. Yet Sneferu didn't give up. Nearby, he began building another, the Red Pyramid. This time the angle was 43 degrees from the start, and it rose to a height of 340 feet, becoming the world's first true smooth-sided pyramid. It was precisely this success that gave Khufu the courage to dream bigger. And here arises the question that has tormented scholars for 2 centuries, how exactly did they lift these multi-ton blocks? Most researchers are confident they used earthen ramps, either straight or spiral. But in the early 21st century, French scientist Joseph Davidovits proposed a radically different explanation. He drew attention to thousands of stone circles with holes found near the pyramids. They had long been considered millstones for grinding grain, but Davidovits noticed, there were no traces of grain residue on them, yet nearby lay enormous piles of fine limestone powder. What if these weren't mills but crushers? What if the Egyptians ground the local soft limestone into dust, mixed it with water, ash, and lime, producing a viscite paste similar to concrete? This paste could be poured directly into wooden forms set at the required height. And to prevent the mixture from sticking to the wood, the forms were lined inside with linen fabric, and indeed, on some blocks, fabric imprints are still visible today, like shadows of ancient cloth captured in stone. A team of scientists from MIT tested this hypothesis. They created an artificial block using the described method, and even specialists couldn't distinguish it from natural stone. But most Egyptologists remain skeptical. They point to the diary of Mirror, the only document written by a participant in pyramid construction. In it, the official mirror describes how his team transported blocks from the Tura quarry via canals dug specifically for this purpose. The blocks were already finished, they weren't poured on site. Perhaps Davidovic's hypothesis is only partially correct. Maybe this is how they made the outer casing, while the interior chambers were built from solid stone. Or perhaps this method was used only in exceptional cases. But the very possibility that ancient Egyptians possessed a technology similar to concrete forces us to reconsider their genius. And now imagine the contrast: on one hand, grand, eternal, stone pyramids whose secrets we are gradually uncovering; on the other, a wonder that may have been created from earth, water, and greenery, and vanished without a trace. These are the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, a structure we know only through words, yet one that for 2 millennia has stirred the imagination of travelers, poets, and scholars. So what do we have before us? The greatest garden of the ancient world, or the greatest myth? For more than 2,000 years, scholars, travelers, poets, and dreamers have tried to answer this question. The first to describe the gardens was the Babylonian priest Berossus, who lived on the island of Kos in the 3rd century BCE, 300 years after the gardens supposedly existed. He wrote for the Greek king Antiochus I and sought to demonstrate how great Babylonian civilization had been. His work survives only in summaries by later authors, but it was he who likely laid the foundation for the legend. Later, in the 1st century BCE, the Roman historian Diodorus Siculus gave the most detailed description. The gardens, he said, were built on a square platform measuring 4 plethra on each side, approximately 400 feet. The walls were 20 feet thick and filled with earth to support the weight of trees. Above them rose 4 tiers of terraces, each supported by vaults. At the very top grew cedars, plane trees, palms, trees reaching heights of 50 or even 65 feet. Water was raised from the Euphrates using a chain pump operated by slaves and distributed through channels to nourish the roots. But here's the strange thing: not a single archaeologist who has excavated Babylon has found traces of these terraces. No foundations, no remains of irrigation systems, not even brick fragments with characteristic water deposits. In 1899, German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, who led excavations at Babylon for nearly 20 years, claimed to have found the gardens in the southern part of Nebuchadnezzar's palace. There were indeed rooms with thick walls and a well nearby. But it was later determined that these were most likely storage rooms or even barracks. The water in the well was too salty for irrigating plants, and the location was in the dustiest, hottest part of the city, far from the river. Decades passed. Technology improved. In the 1990s, British archaeologist Stephanie Daly, a professor at Oxford University, reread all known cuneiform texts and noticed inscriptions by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who ruled from 704 to 681 BCE, 3 centuries before Nebuchadnezzar. In one of his inscriptions, carved on a black basalt cylinder found at Nineveh, Sennacherib wrote, "I built gardens like a mountain and planted there all kinds of trees. I raised water from the river using a device not made by hands and let it flow through the garden like a mountain stream." In another text, he describes an aqueduct 50 miles long, built of stone and fired brick, to deliver water from the mountains to his capital. Archaeologists have found remains of this aqueduct. It still amazes with its precision and scale. And near the royal palace at Nineveh, reliefs depicting multi-tiered gardens with trees and waterfalls. Could it be that Greek authors, reading Babylonian and Assyrian sources centuries later, simply confused the cities? Babylon and Nineveh were both, the east, to them, a place of wonders and luxury. And when they heard of gardens built by a great king, they attributed them to the most famous Babylonian ruler, Nebuchadnezzar, although the gardens actually stood in Nineveh, in Assyria, and were built by Sennacherib. But then another question arises: why did the name Semiramis become so firmly attached to these gardens? Here we encounter yet another confusion of the ages. Semiramis is the Greek name for Queen Samaramat, who ruled Assyria as regent for her young son in the late 9th century BCE. She was so powerful that her name became legend. Greek historians, including Ctesias of Cnidus in the 4th century BCE, attributed to her the building of Babylon, the conquest of India, marriage to an eagle, and, of course, the gardens. But not a single Assyrian text connects her to the gardens. Perhaps it all comes down to the fact that the word hanging, Greek, chromastos, had a double meaning in ancient Greek. It could mean both suspended and overhanging, that is, situated on an elevation. For a Greek accustomed to hilly Greece, the sight of a multi-tiered garden on the flat Mesopotamian plain might have seemed miraculous, as if the trees were floating in the air. Hence the notion of floating gardens. But let's imagine for a moment that the gardens really did exist in Babylon. What would they have looked like? King Nebuchadnezzar II, who ascended the throne in 605 BCE, was a great builder. After the destruction of Babylon by the Assyrians, he rebuilt the city anew. He constructed the Ishtar Gate, decorated with glazed bricks depicting dragons and bulls. He laid the processional way, paved with red and white stone. He erected a new royal palace with hundreds of rooms. And if the legend is true, he built the gardens for his wife Amytis, daughter of the Median king Cyaxares. Media was a mountainous country, modern northwestern Iran. It was cool there, with forests and babbling streams. But Babylon was an endless hot desert, where summer temperatures rose to 120 degrees. No wonder Amytis longed for her homeland. But how could such a garden be irrigated? The Euphrates flowed nearby, but its level was lower than the presumed height of the gardens. This meant a water-lifting mechanism was needed. Perhaps it was a prototype of the Archimedes screw, though Archimedes himself lived 300 years later. Or, as Diodorus wrote, a wheel with buckets powered by people or animals. Such devices were known in ancient China and Egypt. Interestingly, in 2013, a team of engineers from the University of Chicago reconstructed a possible irrigation system and concluded that maintaining a garden measuring 400 by 400 feet would require lifting about 40,000 gallons of water per day. That's work for dozens of people, around the clock. But then, where are the traces of this system? Why is there not a single canal, not a single pipe, not a single brick with calcium deposits from evaporating water in Babylon? Perhaps the gardens were temporary, built of wood and reeds, like many Babylonian structures, and disappeared within a few generations. Perhaps they were dismantled for bricks after Babylon fell to the Persians in 539 BCE. Or perhaps they never existed at all, and the entire story arose from poetic exaggeration, then repeated like an echo by dozens of authors. Today, in the 21st century, the debate continues. In 2022, a group of researchers from the Berlin Museum analyzed soil in the area of the presumed gardens and found no traces of organic remains characteristic of long-term tree growth. But other scientists object. Over 2.5 millennia, any traces could have vanished. So who is right? Perhaps one day, beneath layers of sand near Mosul, ancient Nineveh, archaeologists will find the remains of those very terraces described by Sennacherib. And then we'll understand, the gardens were real, but not where we were looking. Or perhaps those who believe that what matters is not the fact but the image are right. The image of paradise on earth. The image of love capable of creating a mountain in the middle of a desert. The image of humanity striving for beauty even in the hardest times. For even if the gardens are a myth, they inspired thousands of gardens in Persia, Rome, Spain, India. They became the prototype for all terraced gardens in the world. And in this lies their true wonder. But if even such an ephemeral wonder as a garden provokes so much debate, what can be said of those made of gold, ivory, and marble? Of those that amaze the imagination not with greenery but with the majesty of gods? For the next wonder is not merely a statue. It is a living God, seated in a temple before whom Olympians and kings trembled. It is Zeus, created by the hand of Phidias. But consider, how can one depict a god who holds lightning in his hands, commands the heavens, whose very name inspires reverent fear? How can one make it so that mortals, entering the temple, don't merely see a sculpture, but believe they stand before the Lord of Olympus himself? This challenge was taken up by Phidias, the greatest sculptor of ancient Greece. He had already achieved fame with his statue of Athena in the Parthenon, covered in gold and ivory. But Zeus was different. This was not a city's patron but the king of all gods and men. And Phidias understood, his work must not merely be beautiful, it must transform the consciousness of whoever beheld it. The temple where the statue would stand had been built half a century earlier, between 470 and 456 BCE. It was dedicated to Zeus because here, in Olympia, according to legend, his father Cronus had hidden him from the child-devouring monster. Here too, according to tradition, Zeus battled his father and won, establishing a new order in the world. And here, every 4 years, the Olympic Games were held, not sport as we think of it today, but a religious festival dedicated to Zeus himself. Phidias arrived in Olympia around 435 BCE. He was already past 50. He brought with him a workshop, apprentices, tools, and a plan that astonished even the priests. The statue would stand 40 feet tall, almost like a 4-story building. It would be seated on a throne, yet even sitting, its head would nearly touch the temple ceiling, which was only 50 feet high. Imagine, you enter the dimness, your eyes adjust to the light, and before you, a giant, clad in gold and ivory, with eyes of precious stones, lightning in his right hand and a figure of Nike, goddess of victory, in his left. His beard, crafted from the finest ivory plates, seems soft as the real thing. His sandals, of gold. Even the throne is decorated with scenes from myths, Heracles wrestling the Nemean lion, gods battling giants, and on the footstool, small figures of Amazons. But the most astonishing thing was the materials. The entire visible body, face, hands, feet, was made of ivory. Not carved, but thinly sliced and glued together like a mosaic. And the clothing, hair, beard, lightning, of pure gold, several millimeters thick. By modern historians' estimates, the statue required about 2,600 pounds of gold and no less than 5 tons of ivory. These were the riches of an entire state. The Hellenes, rulers of Olympia, collected them from tribute paid by Greek cities for the right to participate in the games. But how could ivory be preserved from cracking in the hot climate of the Peloponnese? Phidias knew, ivory dries, warps, cracks. So he ordered the temple floors to be constantly doused with oil. Yes, not water, Oil. Olive oil. It evaporated slowly, creating a humid but not rot-inducing atmosphere. Additionally, the oil protected the statue's wooden frame from insects. The Greek geographer Pausanias, who visited Olympia in the 2nd century CE, wrote, "Everything inside the temple is saturated with oil, and even the air seems greasy from it. Imagine the smell, a blend of olive, incense, wood, and metal. Silence. And that gaze, calm, all-seeing, divine. But here's a question that puzzles scholars: did the statue move? In the 1st century BCE, the Roman writer Lucian mentions that Zeus seemed to breathe. Other texts say, his eyes followed you. Of course, this may be poetic exaggeration. But what if Phidias used optical illusions? For example, the eyes might have been made of polished stone or glass reflecting light from the temple's single window. As the viewer moved, the reflection shifted, and it seemed the god was watching you. There's even a hypothesis that mechanisms were hidden inside the throne, operated by attendants, a barely perceptible movement of the hand, a trembling of the lightning bolt. After all, Phidias worked in an era when Greeks were already building automatons, mechanical figures that moved at banquets. Why not use this in a temple? And yet, the main mystery lies not in technique but in impact. Ancient authors are unanimous: whoever saw the statue was changed. Greeks said, to see Zeus is to understand what greatness means. The Roman Emperor Caligula in the 1st century CE even ordered the statue transported to Rome, to place it in his palace. But the ship carrying it was wrecked on rocks. This was taken as an omen: the god did not wish to leave his temple. What became of the statue? According to one version, it stood in Olympia until the 5th century CE, when the Christian emperor Theodosius I banned pagan cults. The temple was closed, and the statue was transported to Constantinople, where it stood in a special hall. There, in 475 CE, the palace burned, and the statue vanished. But there's another version. The Byzantine historian Zosimus writes that the statue was dismantled in the 4th century, and the gold was melted into coins. The ivory was burned, as a symbol of idolatry. Today we know what it looked like only from coins minted in Olympia and from Pausanias's descriptions. Not a single fragment has been found. Not a piece of gold, not a splinter of ivory. Why? Because gold is always melted down. And ivory burns like paper. But imagine, if it had survived. If we could enter that temple, smell the oil, see light gliding across the golden robe. What would we feel? Fear. Awe. An understanding of our own smallness before eternity. Perhaps this is precisely why it was called a wonder. Not because of its size. Not because of the gold. But because it made people feel the presence of the divine, in a world where gods were not metaphor but reality. And if even a statue created by human hands could evoke such feeling, what can be said of those who built a home for Artemis herself, a goddess whose power was so great that her temple became a pilgrimage site for the entire ancient world? For the next wonder is not merely a building. It is the heart of the ancient world, where kings came to leave offerings and common people came to pray. It is the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. But before we envision its grandeur, ask yourself, can a temple be a bank, a museum, a hotel, and a sanctuary all at once? Can a single building become so important to an entire region that its destruction would cause mourning throughout the Mediterranean? And can someone who never held a hammer become the cause of its destruction, simply so that his name would be remembered? The Temple of Artemis was built in the city of Ephesus, on the western coast of Asia Minor, in modern Turkey. But its history begins long before stone and columns. Here, at the source of the Cayster River, even in the Neolithic era, thousands of years before the Greeks, there existed a sanctuary to a great mother goddess, patroness of fertility, beasts, and the heavens. When the Greeks arrived here in the 11th century BCE, they did not destroy the cult, they reinterpreted it. They called the goddess Artemis, their huntress, virgin, patroness of the moon. But the image remained ambiguous. The Ephesian Artemis was not a slender huntress with a bow. Her statue, standing inside the temple, depicted a woman in lavish robes with many protrusions on her chest. Traditionally she was considered many-breasted, a symbol of abundance. But modern scholars, including Professor Gerald Bromberg of the University of Chicago, assert, these are not breasts but amulets, bull testicles, pieces of amber, sacred stones hung from her garments as pilgrims' offerings. Perhaps even silkworm cocoons, for Ephesus was a center of the silk trade. The first temple on this site was wooden, built, according to legend, by the Amazons themselves, the warrior women who, Greeks said, founded Ephesus. But the true flourishing began in the 6th century BCE, when the Lydian king Croesus, the wealthiest man of his time, decided to make an offering to the temple. He donated 100 columns of white marble, each crowned with a bronze statue. The temple became not just a religious center, it became an economic hub for the entire region. Pilgrims from all of Greece, Egypt, and Persia came here to leave offerings, gold, silver, precious stones. The temple stored them in special treasuries, and lent them out at interest. It was here, in Ephesus, that the concept of temple credit was born. Even cities borrowed money from Artemis to build fleets or pay mercenaries. The Greek historian Strabo wrote, "The temple of Artemis is not only a sanctuary but a treasury, more secure than any fortress." But in 356 BCE, on the night Alexander the Great was born, the temple was burned to the ground. The arsonist was a young Ephesian named Herostratus. When he was caught and asked why he did it, he answered, "So that my name would live forever." The Ephesians were furious. They sentenced him to death and forbade speaking his name under penalty of death. But the historian Theopompus, living at the same time, recorded it, and Herostratus's name did indeed become immortal. History's irony: he wanted fame, and achieved it through a crime against the most sacred place. The temple was rebuilt, even more magnificent. This time it was financed not only by the Lydians but by all the Greek cities. The colonnade grew to 127 marble columns, each 60 feet tall, decorated with reliefs and gilding. The temple became nearly twice as long as the Parthenon, 450 feet long, 225 feet wide. Its roof was supported by a system of beams that, according to Vitruvius, were made of cedar from Lebanon, the same wood used in building Solomon's temple. But here's the mystery: why can no modern archaeologist say exactly what the inner altar looked like? Why has not a single accurate copy of Artemis's statue survived? Because Christians, who came to power in the 4th century CE, considered her an idol of a false goddess. They destroyed the temple stone by stone, melted down the metal, burned the wood, and completely destroyed the statue. Today, the British Museum holds only fragments of the foundation and a few column remnants, all that remains of one of antiquity's wealthiest buildings. And yet, imagine, you enter the temple. The air is filled with the scent of incense and sea salt. Light penetrates through gaps between columns, playing on golden ornaments. Along the walls, Hundreds of offerings, golden bowls, silver shields, ivory figurines. In the center, she, Artemis. Not smiling. Not threatening. Simply present. And you understand, you're not standing in a building. You're standing at the intersection of the world of humans and the world of gods. But if even a temple that was simultaneously a bank, museum, and sanctuary could vanish without a trace, what can be said of those who built tombs to glorify love? Of those who erected mausoleums not for gods but for a man, and did it so magnificently that his name became a common noun? For the next wonder is not a tribute to a deity. It is the cry of love, carved in marble. It is the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. But before we glimpse its grandeur, ask yourself, can the death of one person shake an entire era? Can a woman, ruling in a world where power belonged to men, perform an act that would make historians for 2 millennia debate, was she mad with grief, or genius in her sorrow? The story begins in 377 BCE, when a king named Mausolus ascended the throne of the Carian city of Halicarnassus, now Bodrum, Turkey. He was a satrap, that is, a governor, of the Persian Empire, but ruled as an independent sovereign. He spoke Greek, dressed like a Greek, built like a Greek, but in his soul remained a Carian, a people living between East and West. He dreamed of making Halicarnassus the cultural capital of the Aegean Sea. And he almost succeeded. But in 353 BCE, Mausolus died. He was just past 50. The cause of death, according to some sources, was a prolonged liver disease. But the most astonishing events began after his death. His wife and sister, yes, in Carian tradition, marriages between siblings were common, Artemisia too, ascended the throne. And instead of arranging a modest funeral, she declared, "I will erect a tomb for him worthy of a god. So that the whole world will know, there was and will be no ruler like him." But her act, described by the Roman historian Valerius Maximus, shocked even the ancient Greeks. He wrote, "Artemisia mourned her husband so deeply that she mixed his ashes with water and drank it every day, saying, 'Thus I will keep him inside me.'" Modern scholars, of course, consider this a metaphor, or an exaggeration. But the fact remains, Artemisia refused new marriages, devoting herself to only one goal, building the tomb. And she did something unprecedented. She announced a competition among the best sculptors and architects of Greece. Whoever created the best design would receive the commission of the century. 4 of the greatest masters of their time answered the call. Scopas of Paros, known for his passionate, almost dramatic figures, Leocares, future creator of the Apollo Belvedere, Bryaxis, master of realistic portraits, and Timotheus, an architect specializing in temple compositions. They did not compete, they worked together. Each was responsible for his own section. Scopas sculpted the eastern side, Leocares the western, Bryaxis the northern, and Timotheus oversaw the overall design. This was the first case in history when 4 geniuses united for a single work. What did they create? The tomb stood on a hilltop in the city center. Its base, a rectangular pedestal of white marble, 130 feet long, 100 feet wide, 65 feet high. Above it rose a colonnade of 36 Ionic columns, each 40 feet tall. Between the columns, sculptural groups depicting battles of Amazons, centaurs, gods. And above all this, a stepped pyramid, crowned by a 4-horse chariot of white marble, in which stood figures of Mausolus and Artemisia, holding each other's hands. The total height of the structure, 148 feet. That's taller than most medieval European churches. But the most striking thing, there is not a single depiction of death. No grief, no tears, no underworld. Only life, movement, strength. As if Mausolus hadn't died, he had simply passed into another world, where he continues to rule beside his beloved. Artemisia died just 2 years after construction began, in 351 BCE. She didn't live to see its completion. But her will was so strong that the masters continued working for another 10 years, without a patron, only out of respect for her grief. And here's the question that still intrigues historians: why did this particular tomb become a wonder? After all, there were many mausoleums in the ancient world. But only this one made Antipater's list. Perhaps because it united East and West, Carian form, Greek sculpture, Persian monumentality. Perhaps because it was not about death but about the eternal life of love. Or perhaps because it stood so long, more than 1600 years, surviving Rome, Byzantium, Arab raids. It was not destroyed by wars. Not by fires. It was destroyed by earthquakes, in the 12th, 13th, and especially the 15th centuries. But even then, the stones didn't disappear. In 1494, the Knights Hospitaller, building the castle of St. Peter in Bodrum, dismantled the mausoleum block by block and used the marble for walls. When British archaeologist Charles Thomas Newton arrived at the site in the 19th century, he found sculpture fragments in the castle walls. Today they are housed in the British Museum, including the famous full-length statue of Mausolus, his face full of dignity and peace. But imagine, you stand before the mausoleum in the 4th century BCE. The sun reflects off the white marble. Wind stirs the garments of sculptural figures. And you understand, this is not a tomb. This is a monument to human feeling, erected in an era when most monuments were built for gods or victories. Here, the love of two people became the cause of a wonder. And if even such a personal, such an intimate feeling could give birth to something worthy of eternity, what can be said of those who built not for love, not for gods, but for the glory of a city? Of those who erected a statue to show the world, we are free, we are strong, we are unconquerable. For the next wonder is not a tomb, not a temple, not a statue of a god. It is a symbol of independence. It is the Colossus of Rhodes. But before we envision its grandeur, ask yourself, can defeat become victory? Can a city, besieged by the mightiest warrior of its time, transform the enemy's weapons into a monument to its freedom? And can a bronze statue, standing for less than one human lifetime, leave a mark on history that outlasts empires? It all began in 305 BCE, when a fleet of 2,000 ships appeared on the horizon of Rhodes. It was led by Demetrius Poliorcetes, the besieger, son of Antigonus the One-Eyed, one of Alexander the Great's generals. He came to subjugate Rhodes, an island that refused to recognize his authority and traded with his enemies, the Egyptian Ptolemies. The Rhodians were desperate. Their city was small, only 30,000 inhabitants. They had no army capable of opposing Demetrius. But they had pride. And they did the impossible, they withstood a siege of 365 days. Demetrius deployed the most terrifying machines of his time. The Helepolis, a siege tower 148 feet tall as the mausoleum, 65 feet wide, on wheels, with bridges for assault, battering rams weighing 10 tons each, catapults hurling stones weighing 175 pounds. But the Rhodians held. They built counter towers, set fire to the machines, made night sorties. And when, after a year, Demetrius, having lost thousands of soldiers and realizing the city could not be taken, departed, he left all his siege equipment on the shore. And then the Rhodians did something that astonished the entire ancient world. They sold all that iron and bronze, more than 300 tons of metal, and with the proceeds decided to erect a statue of Helios, god of the sun and patron of the island. The project was entrusted to Chares of Lindos, a student of the great sculptor Lysippus, creator of the canon of human body proportions. Chares knew, the statue must not merely be large, it must be a symbol. It must tell the world, we endured. We are free. Construction began in 292 BCE and lasted 12 years. The statue rose slowly, layer by layer. Inside, a stone and iron framework, on top, bronze plates, 2 to 5 centimeters thick, fastened with copper rivets. Height, 108 feet. That's taller than the Statue of Liberty up to the waist. The head was so large that 10 people could fit inside its crown. Ancient authors write that the eyes were inlaid with precious stones, and on the chest, an inscription, 75 quadrigi, chariots, are harnessed to the ascent of Helios. The Rhodians erected me, standing on earth, toward the sky. But here's the main mystery that has stirred imaginations for 1500 years, did the Colossus stand with legs straddling the harbor? You've probably seen such images, a gigantic statue with legs spread apart, ships passing between them. This idea arose in the Middle Ages, among Arab geographers, and became fixed in European culture. But physically, it's impossible. In 2018, a team of engineers from Cambridge University conducted computer modeling. They accounted for the statue's weight, approximately 70 tons, wind load in the Aegean Sea, the strength of bronze and iron, the region's seismic activity. Their conclusion, if the Colossus had stood with legs apart, the first storm or earthquake would have toppled it. Even without external forces, its own weight would have caused cracks in the groin area within a few years. Modern archaeologists, including Professor Ursula Heller of Berlin University, believe the statue stood on a single pedestal at the harbor entrance, possibly on the Acropolis. Its pose was classical, one arm raised, as if blessing sailors. But why then did the legend of legs in the harbor arise? Perhaps because the ruined statue lay there so long, 800 years. That travelers saw gigantic fragments on the shore and imagined what it had looked like. The Arab historian al-Idrisi in the 12th century wrote, "The palm of the Colossus alone is so large that an entire family can fit inside it." And indeed, after the earthquake of 226 BCE, just 56 years after completion, the statue fell. The knees cracked first, the weakest point. But even in ruins, it remained a wonder. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder in the 1st century CE wrote, "Even fallen, it amazes with its grandeur. No one can wrap their arms around its thumb." The Egyptian king Ptolemy III offered the Rhodians money for restoration. But the oracle at Delphi answered, "Helios himself will protect his image. Do not touch it." And they didn't. The enormous fragments lay on the ground until the 9th century CE, when Arab merchants bought the metal and shipped it to Syria. They say it took 900 camels to transport it. Think about it, the statue stood for less than one human lifetime. But in those 56 years, it became a symbol of unconquered spirit. And even in ruins, a reminder, freedom is worth fighting for. And if even such a short-lived wonder could inspire generations, what can be said of those who built not for glory, not for love, not for gods, but for human need? Of those who erected a lighthouse to save thousands of lives on a stormy sea? For the next wonder is not a work of art, and it's not merely a wonder but the world's first smart engineering structure, combining architecture, optics, logistics, and even a signaling system, because sometimes the greatest wonder is one that saves lives, not dazzles the eye. This is the seventh wonder of the world, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. But before we climb to its summit, ask yourself, can a fire in the night become a symbol of civilization? Can a tower, built not for gods or kings but for ordinary sailors, enter the list of humanity's greatest creations? And can a structure that stood for 1500 years vanish so completely that even its exact location is disputed? It all began with a dream. After the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, his general Ptolemy I Soter seized Egypt and proclaimed himself pharaoh. He wanted his capital, Alexandria, founded by Alexander on the Mediterranean shore, to become the new Athens, a center of knowledge, trade, and culture. But there was one drawback: the harbor entrance was dangerous. Underwater rocks, strong currents, frequent storms, every year dozens of ships were wrecked near the shore. And so Ptolemy made a decision, to build a lighthouse. Not just a tower with fire, but an engineering marvel visible from 30 miles out at sea. The project was entrusted to an architect named Sostratus of Cnidus. But here begins the first mystery. Ptolemy ordered, "My name shall be carved on the lighthouse." Sostratus knew, if he did so, his own name would vanish. So he acted cleverly. He carved on a marble plaque, "Sostratus, son of Dexiphanes of Cnidus, dedicates this to the savior gods on behalf of those who sail the seas." And beneath the inscription, he covered it with a layer of plaster and wrote over it, "Ptolemy, son of Lagus, savior." Within a few decades, the plaster crumbled, and the architect's name became eternal. Thus Sostratus outwitted time. Construction began around 290 BCE and lasted 20 years. The lighthouse was built on the island of Pharos, connected to the mainland by a causeway, which later became the famous Heptastadion, or Seven-Stayed Road. The tower itself had 3 tiers. The lower, a massive square foundation, 200 feet high, with interior rooms for attendants, oil and wood storage. The middle, an octagonal tower, 100 feet high. The upper, a cylindrical turret where the fire burned, crowned by a bronze statue of Zeus Soter, the savior, or, according to other sources, Poseidon. Total height, from 330 to 430 feet. This made it the second tallest structure in the ancient world after Khufu's pyramid. And the tallest non-religious building for almost 2,000 years. But the most astonishing thing was how the light worked. By day, a smoky fire burned at the top, the black smoke was visible far out to sea. At night, fire, but not ordinary fire. According to descriptions by Arab geographers, including Ibn Battuta in the 14th century, the fire chamber contained polished bronze mirrors that concentrated the light and directed it out to sea. Some scholars even suggest the system allowed the beam's direction to be changed, to warn of underwater hazards. Imagine, this was the world's first signaling system. The Arab historian al-Masudi in the 10th century wrote, "Ships coming from Constantinople see the light of Pharos before they see the shore. It burns like a star cast down from heaven." The lighthouse didn't just shine, it served. Within its walls were rooms for scholars, observers, cartographers. Perhaps it was here that data was gathered for the first maritime charts of the Mediterranean. It was part of the Library of Alexandria, not physically, but spiritually. Both were symbols of knowledge serving humanity. It stood for 1500 years. It survived the Romans, Byzantines, Arabs. But in the 14th century, a series of powerful earthquakes, in 1303, 1323, and especially 1375, destroyed it completely. The last ruins disappeared by 1480. But even then, the stones didn't vanish. The Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay ordered the debris collected and built a fortress on the same spot, which stands today. Archaeologists, including Frenchman Jean-Yves Empereur, in the 1990s found granite columns, sphinxes, statue fragments underwater, all that remains of the lighthouse. Some of them now adorn Qaitbay's citadel. And here's the paradox, we don't know exactly what it looked like. Not a single reliable image has survived. All reconstructions are guesses. But we know the main thing, it worked. It saved lives. It gave hope. Imagine, you're a sailor coming from Rome. A storm. Night. You've already resigned yourself to death. And suddenly, in the distance, above the waves, a beam of light. Not bright, not blinding, but calm, steady, constant. You turn toward it. And within an hour, you see the shore. You're alive. This is the wonder. And if even such a practical, such a humane structure became legend, what can be said of everything we've told you today? Of pyramids, gardens, statues, temples, tombs, colossi, and lighthouses. They are all different. Some, for gods, others, for people. Some, of gold, others, of bronze, marble, stone. Some stand to this day, others, are known only through words. But they all share one thing, they were possible only because someone believed, and began to build. And as long as people dream, doubt, and search, such wonders will be born again. But now we want to ask you, what did you feel listening to this story? Perhaps you were captivated by the mystery of the pyramids, eternal yet still not fully revealed. Or were you moved by the story of Artemisia, drinking the ashes of her beloved to keep him inside her? Or perhaps you wondered for the first time, what if the Hanging Garden stood not in Babylon but in Nineveh, and all this time we've been looking in the wrong place? Write to us in the comments. Which of the 7 wonders seemed most astonishing to you, and why? Would you like us to tell you more about one of them in a separate episode? Or perhaps you dream of traveling there, to the ruins of Ephesus, to the Giza Plateau, to ancient Olympia? Tell us where you'd go first, perhaps your letter will inspire our next journey, or even a collaboration with those who help make such journeys come true. If you enjoyed this story, if it made you think, imagine, feel, subscribe to Midnight Archives. Ahead of us are not only new wonders but lost cities, mysteries of vanished civilizations, great libraries, and legends that may have been true. We won't shout. We won't rush. We'll simply tell stories, quietly, precisely, with respect for the past and for you. Thank you for being with us. Until we meet again in the Midnight Archives.